Good afternoon and welcome to a new episode of Africa Today. We have a lot in store for you in this episode. Today we're going to be focusing on the climate change and climate action, specifically the conference that is taking place right now in Kenya. And on behalf of the President, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the Prime Minister, Mustafa Madbouli, is there to participate in the Africa Climate Summit in Kenya's capital in Nairobi, which opened up today. The three-day event is Africa's first climate summit and will be attended by several heads of states and of governments in African states, in addition to international organizations. The Prime Minister is to deliver 3 speeches during the summit, first of which will be on climate action in light of Egypt's presidency of the COP27. And the Minister of Irrigation is also there to participate, the aim is, as he says, is a unified African vision to deal with climate issues ahead of the November COP28 in Dubai. Egypt's delegation also includes the Minister of Environment, Yasmin Fouad, who participates in the capacity of a ministerial coordinator and the envoy for COP27. She stressed the summit is a key opportunity to discuss African priorities and prerequisites. And joining us over the phone to tell us more about the conference is Dr. Magdi Allam, a climate expert. Good evening, rather good afternoon to you, sir. Dr. Magdi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
Can you tell us a bit about the significance of today's conference in Kenya? Specifically for the African continent in general, why is it important for the African continent to take a look at what's important when it comes to climate action?
Actually, it's one of the activities, of the main activities to be done in the African continent, and actually related to the Kenya and its role among the African countries will push in front the activities and the cooperation between the African countries, including Egypt, of course, and the northern Arab countries, starting from Morocco till Syria. And this is actually one group to have some assumptions in the summit next 28, because we finished in 27 the CO2 emissions to be reduced in cooperation between the industrial countries, the petroleum countries, and the other countries. And it was at that time being among the initiatives to reduce the CO. To reduce the CO and the NO and the XO also, so the sulfur, the nitrous, and also the other 7 or 6 main items of the greenhouse gases, which affect all the climate change that we are suffering now in Africa. So as the drought has an expansion in the south and the north and the middle Africa, is affecting a lot of the nutrition status, and the poverty itself increasing because of the water resources reduction. And some of them also because the degradation of their green vegetation is also even for grazing. So this is actually challenges in front of the Africa to cooperate together how to deal with the water resource scarcity, how to apply the nexus, the water, energy, and the other sources of food. So this nexus is actually the triangle that we are relying to improve the status of nutrition among the African citizens, especially in the countries that are affected by the desertification and drought. In some countries, there is a displacement of the rain in the areas, with displacement actually out of the resources, natural resources of the African farmers who are suffering nowadays from less nutrition, less food also for their animals and craving for this, and also the other sources of energy. Nowadays, they are relying on the trees to cut it and fire it to use it as a fuel. Nowadays, to shift to the solar energy and to the wind energy as Egypt did in the Suez Gulf, of course, as a good example of the wind generation from the wind tool all over the Suez Gulf. This is a good example for the African countries to apply it again in their countries as a clean and new and renewable energy source.
Sir,
there is also, yes.
I apologize for cutting you off there, but the African continent, according to statistics, is probably the most affected continent when it comes to climate change. And obviously, due to many factors and economic factors, it is also the most in need when it comes to support to combat climate change or combat the effects of climate change. Do you believe this is also up on the table of discussion on how they will manage to get funding from the rest of the world during COP28?
Actually, the technology itself is important, and it is very expensive for the African continent and the African farmers. This is a challenge, the high price of the new equipment, of new energy and renewable energy sources, which is the clean technology. When we are trying to support the farmers in Africa to shift from the traditional irrigation system and also the agriculture system, so we are actually stuck by the high prices of the new technologies and the new energy sources. We are relying on biomass, for example, that we are now all in the African continent, and the farmers there are collecting the agriculture waste and transfer it into biomass and then biogas, so to use it as a fuel for their cooking. But in other point that those natural resources, because it is agriculture waste, so the agriculture waste, we are advised them to use them as a biomass rather than a fuel. So when they are using fuel, they are shifting to the coal, and if they are using the coal, they have more emissions of CO, and so the only way is to depend on the wind energy and to use this wind energy, which is actually on some hills and high surfaces all over the country. They can use it easily and more cheaper, in addition to the other new and renewable energy sources like the biogas and the biomass. And Egypt, of course, is a pioneer in the biogas and generation from the waste, especially the agricultural waste or the solid waste. We are transferring it into energy. So we are actually get rid of the waste problems and in the same time to have a recycling processes. The recycling is very essential for the African countries because this is the most cheapest way to reuse again of the plants and the woods and the trees, not to fire it directly, but use them as a recycled material, even for the plastic or the other kinds of the coverage. Also, we can recycle those materials, not to add more plastic for the plastic problems.
Sir, you spoke about how the African continent could somehow deal with the climate change related to food security and all of that. But there's also the issue of detecting weather changes. According to statistics, African continent is the most affected when it comes to natural disasters because they don't have systems in place. Many countries don't have systems in place to warn of possible natural disasters coming up. How can this be handled?
There are, of course, early warning systems being inserted by Egypt, for example, in cooperation with the northern African countries. And we hope that we can shift the new energy and the renewable energy sources for the other parts of the continent also. But actually nowadays it is so easy to use the wind energy as a clean one. But if we are looking for the gases which is making the problem of the climate change that we are talking about the carbon and the sulfur and the nitrogen and the hydrochlorofluorocarbon and the pyrofluorocarbon and the methane gas. Those are the 6 emitters that are producing the greenhouse gas phenomena, which increasing what's called the heating stress, increasing the temperature, and actually preventing from the 6 emissions to be out of the planet, away from the planet Earth. So this is a problem that the greenhouse gases nowadays are adding for the temperature. We hope that we can reach in the next 50 years only 1.5 degree in excess for the fossil fuel or using any kind of fuel. But the problem that we can expect nowadays that may exceed the 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees. In this case, it will be a so complicated and dramatic negative impact on the agriculture and all the ecosystems in Africa.
Yes, here's hoping we can solve it, but unfortunately we're running out of time. So Dr. Magdi Allameh, Secretary General of the Arab Environmental Experts, thank you so much for joining us over the phone and telling us about the importance of the summit. Moving on with the rest of the episode, Egypt's inclusion in BRICS is to boost infrastructure, free trade in Africa. Lucy Mbaza, the chairperson of the Business Council for BRICS, stated that the inclusion of a North African country like Egypt could bring significant strength to BRICS and also to the African continent free trade area, which aims to be a game-changing trade agreement. Here's the story.
BRICS summit held in South Africa between August 22nd and 24th, that South Africa was among the most enthusiastic supporters of the expansion of BRICS. The group, originally known as BRICS before South Africa inclusion in 2011, is extending an invitation to other countries to join. Among the 6 countries invited to join BRICS, Egypt has gained particular attention. Mabouza emphasized that the inclusion of a North African country like Egypt could bring significant strength to BRICS and also to the African Continental Free Trade Area, which aims to be a game-changing trade agreement. The move will boost the infrastructure that connects African countries, including the Cairo-Cape Town route that spans many countries, all of which can benefit from this infrastructure. Mabouza indicated that the summit discussions revolved around BRICS and Africa communication, advocating at the trade agreement as a significant opportunity for the BRICS countries, especially if they shift from viewing Africa merely as a source of raw materials to investing in the continent. Mabouza, who also serves as the chairperson of South Africa's Industrial Development Corporation, expressed her enthusiasm about the opportunities Egypt and South Africa could share at the BRICS table. The points raised by the chairwoman of BRICS Business Council in South Africa point to the benefits and challenges the country has faced since joining the economic alliance. As for trade relations with China, they reflect the global shift towards Asia as a center for economic growth. This enhances the importance of diversifying trade and investment partners for South Africa.
The United Nations said that children in Africa are among the most at risk of the impacts of climate change, but are woefully neglected by the key financing flows required to help them adapt, survive, and respond to the crisis. Here's the story.
The United Nations said that children in Africa are among the most at risk of the impacts of climate change, but are woefully neglected by the key financing flows required to help them adapt, survive, and respond to the crisis. According to a new report by the children's agency UNICEF, youngsters in 48 out of 49 African countries assessed are categorized as at high or extremely high risk to the impacts of climate change. The analysts assessed nations based on children's exposure to climate and environmental shocks such as cyclones and heat waves, as well as their vulnerability to those shocks based on their access to essential services. Africa is home to some of the countries least responsible for carbon emissions, but is hit disproportionately hard by droughts, flooding, storms, and heat waves. The UNICEF report was published days before the first ever Africa Climate Summit to be held in Kenyan capital Nairobi next week. The UN agency said that less than 3% of global funding to tackle climate change was directed at children and called for more to be done, especially by the private sector. The UNICEF said children are physically less able to withstand and survive hazards such as floods, droughts, storms, and heat waves, and they are physically more vulnerable to toxic substances such as lead and other forms of population. The UN agency found that children in the Central African Republic, Chad, Nigeria, Guinea, Somalia, and Guinea-Bissau are the most impacted.
And we end the show with a last report. UNICEF warns a spike in conflict and displacement in the eastern DRC is pushing children into the worst cholera crisis since 2017 across the country, where there have been at least 31,000 suspected or confirmed cholera cases. Thank you for watching the show, and we end it with this following report.
Across the DR Congo, there have been at least 31,342 suspected or confirmed cholera cases and 230 deaths in the first 7 months of 2023. Many of them are children. The worst affected province, North Kivu, has seen more than 21,400 confirmed or suspected cases, including more than 8,000 children under 5, according to the Ministry of Public Health. This compares to 5,120 total cases in all of 2022, with 1,200 of them children under 5. The size of the cholera outbreak and the devastation it threatens should ring alarm bells. If urgent action is not taken within the next month, there is a significant risk that the disease will spread to parts of the country that have not been affected for many years. The DRC, which shoulders the worst displacement crisis in Africa, is among the worst globally, with more than 6.3 million displaced people across the country. Displacement camps are generally overcrowded and overstretched, making them the ripe for cholera transmission. The UNICEF is calling for $62.5 million to scale up its prevention and response activities to the cholera and sanitation crisis over the next 5 months. The agency aims to reach 1.8 million people, including 1 million children, with safe water hygiene kits, latrines, medical supplies, and child-friendly cholera care. Currently, the appeal is just 9% funded.